nobody saw where Jesus actually went. Acts chapter 1 tells the whole story in one sentence. A cloud took him on a hillside outside Jerusalem, and he vanished. No coordinates, no destination, just an empty sky and 11 men staring up at it. Where did he go? What did ascended into heaven really mean to a first-century Jew? And who is the man a few chapters later who looked straight through the door Jesus went through and told us what he saw on the other side? Let's get into it. 40 days after the resurrection, Jesus walks the disciples out of Jerusalem to a ridge just east of the city, the Mount of Olives. Olive groves, pale stone, the temple visible in the afternoon light below. Now, most readers fly right past the location. They shouldn't. The Mount of Olives isn't random geography. Roughly 500 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Zechariah wrote about this specific ridge, and he wrote something very particular about it.
On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two.
So when Jesus leads the disciples out to this particular hillside to say goodbye, he's standing on the spot the Hebrew scriptures had already marked 5 centuries earlier as the arrival point of the Messiah, which is a strange place to choose for a departure, unless the departure and the arrival are somehow the same door. He gives them his last instructions.
Stay in the city. Wait for what was promised. You will carry this message, first here, then through the countryside, and finally to the ends of the earth.
Then Luke writes the sentence the church has been trying to understand ever since. After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. 3 words do the heavy lifting in that verse: taken up, cloud, and each one opens into something the disciples would have understood instantly, and most of us miss entirely. We're going to take them one at a time. Let's start somewhere nobody starts. If Jesus went up from the Mount of Olives, where did he actually go? Because Earth is a spinning ball of rock moving through a solar system inside a galaxy that's itself in motion, up from Jerusalem at 10 in the morning points in a completely different direction than up from Jerusalem at 10 at night. 12 hours later, you're aiming at the opposite side of the galaxy. 6 months later, the Earth is on the other side of the sun, and up points somewhere else again. So if we take ascended into heaven as a literal straight-line trip upward, Jesus is either past Alpha Centauri by now or cruising through the Andromeda Galaxy at roughly 30,000 miles an hour, depending on what time he left. Which, respectfully, is probably not the picture Luke had in mind when he was writing. For most of Christian history, people pictured heaven as a location somewhere above the clouds. The stars were holes in the floor of paradise. Climb high enough and you'd get there. This picture made sense when the sky was a ceiling nobody had been through yet. We don't live in that cosmos anymore. We've been past the clouds, past the moon, past the nearest planets. Telescopes look farther into space than the ancient world could conceive of. And so far, nobody has bumped into a throne. Something else is happening on that hill. In Hebrew, the word for heaven is shamayim, and it's carrying a lot more weight than the English word lets on. The first century Jewish mind divided reality into layers. There was eretz, the ground under your feet. There was the atmosphere, where birds flew and weather happened. There was the visible sky, full of sun, moon, and stars. And then there was another layer, one the human eye couldn't reach. A realm where God lived. It wasn't up the way a ceiling is up. It was adjacent, a separate order of reality running parallel to this one, like a second track on a record playing at the same time, but on a completely different frequency. The Apostle Paul actually makes this framework explicit in his second letter to the Corinthians. He talks about being caught up to the third heaven during some kind of vision. 3 heavens: the air, the stars, and the throne room. Paul assumes his readers already know the structure. It was the cosmology first-century Jews breathed. So when the disciples watched Jesus rise off the ground, they weren't imagining a journey to a distant planet or a flight past the constellations. They were watching him cross out of this layer of existence into the layer Jacob glimpsed in his dream of a ladder full of angels, the layer that poured through the torn temple curtain on the day Jesus died, the layer Ezekiel saw, full of wheels and thrones. Now the cloud. And this is where most people's eyes glaze over and move on, which is exactly the wrong response. Every time God shows up physically in the Old Testament, he shows up in a cloud. Sinai, cloud so heavy the mountain smokes. The tabernacle, cloud fills it so thick the priests can't even stand up to do their jobs. Solomon's temple at dedication, same thing. Priests evacuated. The transfiguration, cloud rolls in. Father speaks out of it. The Jews had a specific word for this, Shekinah. Moses wasn't standing on Sinai thinking, bit overcast today. This was the visible weight of God's presence, dense enough for human eyes to register. So when Luke writes, "A cloud took him," to every Jewish reader in his audience, that phrase meant one thing. That detail alone rewrites the whole scene. And here's what makes it stranger. This same cloud has appeared at every major turning point in Israel's story. Sinai, the wilderness, the temple, the transfiguration. Each time, something enormous is happening between God and his people. So why does it appear here one final time? Remember the promise from the very start of this video. Somebody, a few chapters after the Ascension, looks straight through the door Jesus went through and tells us what he saw on the other side. Here he is. His name is Stephen, one of the first deacons of the Jerusalem church, standing in front of the Sanhedrin, the exact same council that sentenced Jesus to death 6 weeks earlier, delivering a sermon that's about to get him killed.
You stiff-necked people, with uncircumcised hearts and ears.
Partway through, something happens to his face. Luke writes,
I see heaven open, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.
He sees him. From a courtroom floor in Jerusalem, Stephen looks through the veil and finds Jesus exactly where the apostles had been claiming he was. Now, here's what that position actually meant. In the ancient world, the right hand of a king was where the co-regent sat, the one entrusted to rule on the king's behalf. The position carried the full weight of the king's authority. Every person in that Sanhedrin chamber knew exactly what Stephen was describing. A carpenter's son from Nazareth, executed 6 weeks earlier, seated as co-ruler of the reality that underlies our own. And Luke's word for it, taken, means something acted on him. He was received, escorted. He didn't go under his own power. Stephen saw exactly where. Saul watched Stephen look through that door and die with a smile on his face. He spent the next several years trying to forget it. Then Jesus met him on a road in Damascus, from the same side of the veil Stephen had seen, and Saul became Paul. The same man you saw earlier in this video, writing about being caught up to the third heaven. Back on the hillside, the 11 disciples still haven't moved. Their rabbi just disappeared into a cloud of glory, and they are standing there with their necks craned back, mouths slightly open, staring at an empty sky. Like 11 men who just watched a bus drive away and genuinely cannot process it. 2 angels appear beside them. The first thing out of their mouths isn't comfort or explanation.
Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky?
A polite snap out of it, because the most consequential mission in human history started the moment Jesus disappeared. And these 11 men are watching clouds. So they turn around and they walk down the hill toward Jerusalem, toward a city that just executed their rabbi 6 weeks earlier, toward a world they've been asked to change with 11 people, no budget, and no plan. What shifted between the men who fled the Garden of Gethsemane in terror and the men who walked toward Jerusalem that morning without flinching? Nobody saw where Jesus went that day. They didn't need to. They already knew.